Hello and welcome to the November 17th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway, doing this one again on my own because I am still in America and scheduling is complicated. However, I will be returning to Ukraine by later this week and will hopefully return to a more regular podcast. Sorry about the interruptions. Travel's complicated. So this episode, as the title of it will indicate, is the election episode. If you had listened to literally anything we have ever said about U.S. politics and leading up to the election, and especially the episode we did on J.D. Vance, you would understand what I'm about to say, which is that it went quite badly. So, might as well start with just the simple facts of what happened. So, Trump won. Trump beat Kamala Harris, and in a very convincing manner. This was the first time that a Republican actually won the popular vote since 2004, though not by much, like all U.S. elections, and this will play a very important role in how I talk about the analysis of it. Basically, every U.S. president election since Obama has been very close in terms of numbers, and therefore pulling any real analysis from them is virtually impossible. A swing of 2 percentage points in any direction is statistically meaningless, and therefore political science as a whole is kind of just making stuff up. That said, it has been something of a political truism for a long time that Republicans can't win the popular vote, as in the raw number of votes that happen. I mean, I suppose I should take a pause here for our non-American listeners, basically how the U.S. election works. If you've not listened to any other election coverage, which I highly doubt, we're an engaged bunch here at Ukraine Without Hype. But every state in the U.S. is allotted a certain number of points, and if you win the election in a certain state, you get awarded all those points. That's basically how it works. The electors are really just people and often can vote however you want. But the simple way of understanding it is each state has a certain number of points attached to it based on its population, the number of people it has in the legislature. And while the Republicans are able to game things well enough to win those electoral college votes, they have for a long time gotten less votes total. This election changed that. Trump got more votes than Kamala did. And the other quirk of the Electoral College is that very few states actually matter. Many of them are reliably going to one party or the other, leaving 7 swing states that really decided the whole thing. These swing states are Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. And Trump won every single one of those 7. In addition to the presidential election, there was also the votes for the legislature, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and Republicans took both houses. This means that Trump has what is referred to as the trifecta, where the Republican Party controls both houses of the legislative branch, the executive branch, and outside of the trifecta, they also control the Supreme Court, meaning every higher organ of the United States government is run by the Republican Party, giving that party a lot more room to make big choices without being hampered in one element of the government or another. However, as we'll get into later, with many of Trump's expected appointments to the executive branch is pulling a lot of people from the House of Representatives, so the Republicans don't control the House of Representatives so much anymore because so many of them are being transferred away from their seats into the executive branch. And while most of them will end up just being replaced by other Republicans in what's called special elections, it does mean that the narrow majority that the Republicans had is going to be much more uncontrollable than they may want. Basically, when you have such a narrow control over one of the branches of the legislature, one person having a sick day can throw off all your plans. So there's been a lot of dooming about this trifecta, but you kind of need more than a simple majority. And in the case of the House of Representatives, the Republicans in the short term are even losing the simple majority because of all those appointments. So that is what happened in the elections. I'm sure that you've heard all of this before. I'm sure that most of the things I could say as analysis, you've heard all before in every podcast, news outlet, YouTube channel, and random crazy guy yelling on the street. Really the original form of the podcast. So what can we say as a Ukraine-specific podcast? And I'll get more into the Ukraine-specific stuff later, don't worry. But one thing about being back in America, and in fact, doing some volunteering for the Harris campaign, for the Democrats' door knockers, I was one of those. So I think I can give some insights into why I think the election went the way it did. And honestly, they're not very flattering of hardly anyone, President Company included. Now, really, from the analysis standpoint, what most people are really looking at is the way that a lot of non-traditionally Republican demographics switched to Republican or less strongly Democrat than they had been beforehand. This mainly means Latinos. But I have no special insight into that, so I'm not even going to try to bloviate on that. But I guess on that topic, the only thing that I think I can weigh in on is this issue of the youth vote, where young men have swinged much more Republican than they have in the past by a pretty staggering margin. And that's a good way to talk about the first category of Trump swing voter overall. I think that was important here. And that's the ideological vote. A lot of people, especially young men, and this is a very gendered distribution here, really bought into the whole national conservative, America first, misogynistic, racist, xenophobic, nativist ideology that the Trump campaign and Trump himself have been pushing. But honestly, that's not most of it. If you look and narrow it down to specific groups, young men, I mean, mainly here, that was an important factor. But from talking to people in the US, from seeing things on the campaign, from watching television and all the insane ads that Americans have been subjected to, is I can't wait to go back to Ukraine and lose those American ads, though the election ads are the worst of it. They're gone. But more importantly is these economic issues. Things were just expensive. Groceries are up, cost of living is up, cost of housing is up, and in any presidential election or elections in general, people vote with their wallets. It's the economy, stupid, is the famous line about that. If the economy is doing well, then incumbents tend to win. If the economy is not doing well for people, and there's a lot of ways to measure the economy and a lot of ways the American economy is going quite strong. But in the case of cost of living, it's not. So that's what the election came down to. When people don't like the economy, which is something that is often out of the control of a political party, they vote for something new. And I've heard that pretty directly. People didn't like how things were and thought that Trump would be something undefinably new. Of course, this is crazy to me because Trump has already been president. There's no surprise there. Trump has declared what his policies will be, and it's quite obvious what they will lead to. However, what the median voter, as it is called, how they have explained it to me and many others, is that they were just unhappy with cost of living and therefore wanted something new. However, what they voted for will make things worse. And we'll get more into the aspects of the trade war when I really want to talk about that more in focus of what that means to Ukraine, which will be our last segment. But people did not vote for what they wanted. They just voted because they didn't like how things were. And there's no way to really control for that. So right now, you have the Democratic Party having a circular firing squad where everyone is blaming everyone for why things went the way they went. The moderates are blaming the progressives. The progressives are blaming the moderates. People are saying that this, that, or some other issue is what won or lost the election. And every time I try to look into any one of these explanations, they don't make any sense. They're all wrong. Every single theory I've heard almost has basically been easily falsifiable. People are saying that the reason that the Democrats lost is because they ran too much on identity politics and not enough on the worker. But that's not what happened. Kamala Harris avoided the issue of identity politics altogether, almost. Whenever an interviewer asked her what it would mean for her to be the first woman president, she sidestepped it right away. She ran away from identity politics issues. It was empty from any Democrat advertising I saw whatsoever. It did not exist in the Democratic campaign. What did exist is those workers' rights issues. The core of the Democrat campaign mostly was on abortion, on the idea of, do you remember how bad Trump was and how everyone he's ever worked with hates him? And yeah, a little bit on the whole working class issue. President Biden had done industrial policy, not much industrial policy, but a industrial policy for the first time in a very long time. And that was the record she was running on. So if somebody is saying that, oh, they ignored the working class for identity politics, that's just objectively untrue. You are making up a reality that does not exist. On the flip side, a lot of people on the more progressive side of things are saying that Kamala lost because she did not stick to left-wing issues enough, that the support for Israel in the Israel-Gaza war is, Israel-Gaza war is a minimalist way to put it, really, especially now that it's also in Lebanon. But they've been saying that that was the reason that Kamala lost. But again, let's look at the objective reality. Yes, a lot of people stayed home from voting, and a lot of those people who stayed home from voting said it had to do with support for Israel. But at the same time, in most opinion polling, the issue that Harris really struggled on was people perceiving her as being too left-wing. And as I just went over, that's a nonsense thing to believe, but that was the perception. And if it goes down to what people are voting for, then that doesn't really make any sense. And also, the person who won, and not only won, but won a lot of first-time voters, a lot of low-propensity voters, as they're called, people who are not super politically engaged, those people came out for Trump, and Trump is going to be even more hawkish on Palestine, on Lebanon, than Kamala was. So if that's a losing issue, then why was the person who's even harder on it, why did he win? Those are just some examples. And none of them, not a single one, as I said, makes any sense. So I will just sit back and throw paper airplanes from the back of the class rather than give any real positive explanations of my own, because it's just easier and that's all I can do. Oh well. But what I am really walking away from in this, as I've just mentioned, is that the way people thought about the election, the way that people thought about the issues, had no real connection with reality. People voted on cost of living. All of Trump's economic policies are geared to increase cost of living on purpose. The main economic policy here is tariffs. The purpose of a tariff is to make things more expensive. That's why it exists. You do tariffs because you believe that things being more expensive is good for some sector or another, which I don't know, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But in an election where the vast majority of people explained the reason they were voting had to do with cost of living, then voted for the person who promised to increase cost of living, that makes no sense. And that has to do with Trump being in this reality distortion field. People project what they want to believe Trump is onto what Trump actually is. People listen to him speak. If there's something that he says that they don't like, they just say that he was joking or made it up, or it's just Trump, being braggadocious and offensive because that's how he is. And you don't have to take that seriously. But if there's one thing that you hear that you like, then that's Trump's real belief that he's really going to do it, even if it contradicts other things he says. even if it contradicts what the guy standing right next to you takes away from whatever Trump was saying, and it contradicts. Or sometimes people will make things up and say that Trump said it. Somehow, there are people out there who believe that Trump would work for a ceasefire in Gaza. That is a stupid thing to believe, but a lot of people believe it. Trump is a cipher for whatever you want him to be, and that's why he won. Now, I may sound angry or bitter as I say this, and that's because I am. I am angry, I'm bitter, I'm not going to try to pretend. But also, this reality distortion field, this politics of just saying things, and once they're said, they're true, no matter what was said, or even if you're just straight up lying about what your candidate is claiming, which happens all the time about Trump. My lord. Were you aware that there were no wars during the first Trump administration, which would be a big shock to people from Ukraine, from Syria, from many places around the world where, in fact, there was war, and even places where America was involved in war. But hey, Trump was the era of having no wars. But because there's all these alternative facts, to use the phrase from the first Trump administration, I genuinely don't know what to do with that. You can't be punished for bad policies when people don't believe those bad policies even happened. They can be retconned out of existence, like bad writing. It means that any political messaging is completely detached from any actual policies being proposed or anything like that, which goes back to my critique of the Democratic Party chasing around itself, trying to find the exact policy that they might have gotten wrong. That's irrelevant. If a Trump voter likes a policy, they'll just say that Trump supports it. So whether or not he actually does, there is no policy debate to have like that. But oh well, I'm not going to try to tie my tongue into knots trying to describe this particular phenomenon, this idea of post-truth. It's in the words of the title of the great book about 1990s Russia by Peter Pomerantsev, nothing is true and everything is possible. Yeah, that's kind of where we are. We live in a scenario where nothing is true and everything is possible. Now, I'll give Romeo the right to response here because his belief is that basically the entire Democratic Party should resign and build something new, and he's not wrong in that. I'll definitely give him right of response when I get back to Ukraine and we can sync up recording better. At the same time, I don't think that matters either. I think that would just show weakness. And the Republicans have, whenever they lost an election, they reject all blame, double down, and try again until it works. And here it is working. So yes, I do think there should absolutely be some resignations. You don't lose every single swing state and not have resignations if you're a normal political party. But at the same time, I also think if the Democrats are too self-flagellating, that will just reinforce the media narrative of, see, they had to do this because they're objectively worse. So yeah, I don't think that will help. I don't know what will help. I think everything can only hurt, to be frank. But the last thing I will say about the analysis of how the election went the way it did is that beforehand, I said that the situation in Michigan, the state I'm from, the state that I'm currently recording from, the Republican Party was entirely on its back heels. They had limited funds. The party itself was completely fractured by an earlier fight over leadership. They had very little in the way of ground game, organization, anything. Complete mess. In any normal election, they would not stand a chance because everything about their organization, about their electioneering, complete chaos, useless nonsense. So what I said is that if Trump manages to win Michigan, it will mean that everything that we understand about the election process, everything that we understand about the usefulness of the Democratic political class, about the political technicians, about the professional cast of people who think they understand how politics and elections work, if they don't manage to pull off a win in a place like Michigan, where everything is on their side from a traditional understanding of how elections work, then that traditional understanding of how elections work is outdated and useless. So Trump won, meaning that I have to go with that analysis that everything we understand about how elections work is useless. And the group of people within the Democratic Party who've made a career understanding how elections work are wrong. So they are. As someone who was volunteering for the Harris campaign, that person on the Republican side of things did not really exist. They did not have people doing get out the vote campaigns. It was all media based, all about keeping reality, using the media. That's what everything's about. That's the world we're in. And the legions of people in the Democratic Party who are used to the traditional ground campaigns, the get out the vote campaigns, kind of useless. They were wrong. Again, especially in the context of Michigan, where the Republicans had none of that and still won. But yeah, that's my basic analysis for why what happened, in that everyone chose to believe things that aren't true and nothing matters. That's kind of my takeaway from it. From there, I guess we'll get into like the real meat here is what this means for Ukraine. And the first thing to look at, I think it's very important, is who Trump has made his appointments out to be, who is going to man the executive branch, who is actually going to do the job of government while Trump is in office. And to throw back to the episode that we did on J.D. Vance, the reason why this is so important is because everyone in the Republican Party knows that Trump himself isn't exactly an idea guy. He very much relies on whoever courtier happens to be popular at any given moment, his ideas will push through. And in the first Trump administration, there was a lot of turnover because people came into and fell out of favor very, very quickly. And also a lot of the government branches under the first Trump administration had a lot of leeway over what they wanted to do on their own because of the lack of direction from the president's office himself, with the exception of foreign policy. And I'll get to that. So the imperial court, as it were, the collection of official and unofficial influential people in Trump's orbit telling him the information and what to do. So I'll start with the appointments. Some are not as bad as others, and some are awful. So in order, we'll go with the less bad ones. Begin with this soft intro here, and that's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. In a lot of the Ukrainian commentariat, there was a deep sigh of relief when Waltz was named as the next national security advisor. He has, in the past, been a big Ukraine hawk. He has called to end restrictions on Ukrainian targeting of Russian assets within Russia itself, something that has been a very big deal. And this is not a news episode, but what just happened in the news is that the Biden administration finally relaxed some of its targeting restrictions to allow Ukraine to attack targets in the Kursk Oblast to protect the Ukrainian forces that are in Kursk Oblast occupying a series of villages close to the border. Biden allowed those targeting, but Waltz called for much, much less restricted targeting. That's near the top of what Ukrainians want the United States to do, is to allow Ukraine to strike wherever. Waltz said that he would support that, and in many other ways has had Ukraine's back in a variety of votes and issues that he had a say in. However, that did begin to weaken as the war went on, to the point where he once wrote an op-ed that's available on his website called "The Era of Ukraine's Blank Check from Congress is Over." He voted against Ukraine aid during that big block that the House of Representatives Republicans were doing earlier this year. So yeah, there's been a lot of celebration for the things he said in Ukraine's support, but, and this will go with the Rubio appointment as well, I'll get to that, he knows how to listen to Trump as well. The call came down from Trump to block Ukraine aid in order to do a political play. and he supported it, and not everyone did. He can follow orders, and that is not great. We need people in the Trump White House who know how to tell him no. The next one, John Ratcliffe for CIA director, he's a normal intel guy. I could not find too many things that are exceptionally remarkable about John Ratcliffe for CIA director, but it seems like a solid enough pick, so just moving on from there. But yeah, then Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, again, he has been at times very supportive of Ukraine. Especially early on in the full-scale invasion, he supported a lot of the Ukraine aid and various things that Ukraine needed. But again, like Mike Waltz, as time went on, that support weakened because he knows how to take orders, and the orders were to be more hostile, and he followed them, so he was. To the point where just very recently, just about 2 weeks before the election, I think it was, he came out and reiterated Trump's Ukraine policy almost verbatim by saying that the war needs to end in a ceasefire and Ukraine needs to give up the occupied territories in order to accomplish that. Something that any Ukrainian is rejecting, and not any Ukrainian, but the vast majority of Ukrainians would reject outright. So yes, there was a few Ukraine-friendly appointments. Most of them happened within a span of one day, and by the end of that day, Ukrainians were feeling pretty good. We got those appointments that were not as bad as we thought they could have been. It could have been Vivek Ramaswamy or any other crazy pro-Russia guy into these key positions, and instead we got traditionalist Republican who still have that cold warrior in them somewhere, who know how to fight against the evil empire and do Reagan's legacy right. I think that's a misread, though I'll explain the Ukrainian reaction more at the last segment. But what really binds these okay appointments together is that when it really came down to the grind, they fell in line behind Trump. They're yes men. And yes, it's good that they have these positive policies for Ukraine, but when it comes time for a fight to really push any kind of pro-Ukraine message in the U.S. government, we need fighters. And Trump did not allow any fighters to be in place. I'm thinking mainly of Pompeo, and I do not like Pompeo for many reasons. He was the Secretary of State under Trump the first time around, and I don't like a lot of those policies, but he was the strongest voice probably for a assertively pro-Ukraine policy in the White House, and he was very pointedly rejected for any position in the new Trump administration. There was even a big campaign in order to keep him out that was directed by the far right end of the party. Same thing with Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley was a lot of Ukrainians' pick for potential Republican primary, even though it wasn't really a primary. Haley really stuck with it on this idea of a more traditional Republican policy, which has been friendly to Ukraine, until at the very end, she kind of bends the knee to Trump, as everyone does, and does what he says, and she was still rejected for any position. She tried to do a Marco Rubio of just prostrating herself before Trump in order to win her way into a new administration, except with Rubio it worked, and with Haley it did not. So yeah, these two very strong supporters of Ukraine who had the possibility to get into the Trump admin, Pompeo and Haley, they were out. And not only out, very deliberately left out because of their support to Ukraine as a large part of that. So keep that in mind. And now for the really bad potential nominees, and that's Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. And what makes him bad is not any particular policy, because he doesn't seem to really have any. He's bad because he's just a Republican political pundit with no real thoughts of his own. He was a Fox News guy. On Fox News, he, for example, really pushed to let war criminals off the hook. That seemed to be his main thing, pro-war criminal. And on Ukraine, he gave the kind of typical far-right, brain-dead pundit reaction, which was, I guess I care about Ukraine, but I don't care about Ukraine as much as I care about insert stupid culture war topic that they think is real and important. And that's not good for Ukraine. the kind of far-right infosphere, which he is just a reflection of, is not on Ukraine's side. So if he gets in the first Trump administration, again, we had a defense secretary in the form of Mattis, General Mattis, who was very friendly to Ukraine and was able to push through a lot of support that Trump himself was not especially enthusiastic about, but because of the almost independent power that Mattis held as defense secretary, he really was able to push through, of course, with other parts of the defense establishment and intelligence that did care a bit more about Ukraine than the electeds. But a lot of that support came because of that. And therefore, a defense secretary, which will not put up a fight on Ukraine's behalf. And if Rubio is not reliable as Secretary of State, then Hegseth as Secretary of Defense is absolutely not reliable. And way less reliable, I should say, than even that. We won't have that fighter. And then the worst for Ukraine of the Trump appointees, which is Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. Tulsi Gabbard, the former representative from Hawaii, is actively pro-Russia. Very directly. She has vomited out every bit of pro-Russian propaganda that has entered the American media ecosystem. Whether she has done this directly and knowingly as a Russian asset, or just because she is a complete crank and hooked into what other complete cranks are saying, and what complete cranks are saying is pro-Russian propaganda because Russia has heavily invested in the crankosphere. It's the same thing either way. So this argument over who's a Russian agent and who is not, I will know them by their fruits. And in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, those fruits are 100% to support people like Syrian dictator Assad, Putin, and a bunch of other awful, murderous people who want Ukraine destroyed. And she's now Director of National Intelligence, if she gets through. If she gets through, then that means that she'll be the one handling different intelligence reports and directing them to the president so he can make decisions based on that, though Trump doesn't read those briefings anyway. And frankly, the idea of important intelligence passing through Tulsi Gabbard's desk is horrifying. There has been a lot of problems with leaks under Biden. Under Trump, Gabbard would just be the leak herself. She would just pass off intelligence briefings directly to the Kremlin. Don't need to worry about some idiot talking to a journalist friend in Washington, D.C. bar because he wants to impress them by how important he is and how much information that he can leak out. No, in this case, it'll just be the Director of National Intelligence herself, just sending things directly to Russia. And the last of these official appointments I'll mention will not directly have to do with Ukraine, but is a good segue to the next segment, which is RFK Jr. for Health and Human Services. RFK Jr., who does not believe in medicine or he's a complete kook. He's just a conspiracy kook who the Trump campaign brought on board to win over some of the crunchy vanilla parts of the left, though I don't know how well he himself played a role in that. As Health and Human Services Secretary, he will not directly deal with Ukraine, so I don't know how to mention that, but he is a complete kook, another part of the kookosphere regarding Ukraine. He's said all the crazy conspiracy theories. I'm not going to go through the effort of listing them all. When they believe one, they tend to believe all of them. That's just how the kookosphere works. Though he was seen with one Scott Ritter, the multiple time convicted pedophile, who is a very direct vector for Russian propaganda, and by direct, I mean he just operates out of Russia sometimes. He and RFK Jr. have been photographed together, so that kind of tells you where he will mention Ukraine. And that, as I said, is a good segue to what I think is much more important, which are the unofficial positions, the unofficial part of the Trump court, and by which I mean Elon Musk. Elon Musk, the world's richest man. And again, go back to our Vance episode. I'm very happy with that JD Vance episode. So go back and listen to that again a few more times, really. Get those numbers up. But as we talked about in our Vance episode, Musk is part of this Silicon Valley group of weirdos who are pushing far-right politics, mostly as a way to get rid of any kind of business regulation and taxes and all that, but also because they believe that as rich business people, and especially as wealthy tech billionaires, they are a superior form of human who should be allowed to do whatever they want at the expense of whoever they feel like doing it at the expense of. In the official position Musk is being given is as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, which is a stupid meme name, DOGE, Dogecoin, and stupid internet jokes that he just finds hilarious. Officially, this can mean a few things. It could just be a stupid make-work program to keep him happy. It could also be a way of privatizing every single government service, cutting away at every form of support that people receive, and doing a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of the very wealthy, or somewhere in between those two options. And he, of course, has been very anti-Ukraine. The fact that Ukrainians use Starlink, a form of satellite internet that is, granted, much more reliable than other forms of satellite internet and has been an important part of this war, referring to communications and really everything that we could possibly use internet for. Starlink on the front line is a critical part of that. And because it's owned by a Musk company, Musk has presented that as him being the savior of Ukraine or whatever, even though, people are paying for it as a service. You don't necessarily have to thank the person who built your car because you drive places. It's silly. You paid money for a thing and then you got that thing. But he has used that setup to then rhetorically turn on Ukraine and demand that Ukraine surrenders to Russia as part of this plan that I mentioned already in the form of Pompeo, which is the Trump plan to freeze the war on the current line of conflict. And if Ukraine does not agree to do that, pull away any form of support to force the issue more, which of course wouldn't work. Russia would just use that as a reason to attack even harder, but never mind that for now. And Musk is going to be part of what I'm going to consider the kind of unofficial cabinet, because he has really seemed to have Trump's ear. They are seen together constantly now. Trump and Zelensky have already had a call. Musk was on that call. Musk seems to be on a lot of calls right now. He seems to be very powerful in the incoming administration. I don't know how long that may last, considering they are both the most narcissistic person who ever lived, and that can only last so long until there's a blow up between them. But as of right now, and who knows for how long, Musk seems to be one of the most important parts of the incoming administration, despite not having a real role in it outside of this fake Department of Government Efficiency. Elon Musk as the gray cardinal. That's a scary thought. But it's not just Musk. He is coming in as part of this alternative cabinet of Musk, Donald Trump Jr., and J.D. Vance, vice president, of a kook cabinet, the cabinet that stores all the things that you don't want seen in public. I don't know how to refer to this as. The kook cabinet has that good alliteration to it, so I'll just go with that. So in the kook cabinet of Vance, Musk, and Trump Jr., that is where there is a lot of concentration of very dangerous ideology, this extreme far right, this extreme, everything we talked about in the Vance episode, go back and listen, of fundamental hostility to the concept of democracy, of wanting to tear down every institution that exists to govern democratically and replace it with just straight up rule by a group of wealthy oligarchs who have attachment to extremist political far-right philosophers such as Curtis Yarvin, who are themselves just fascists. This is the group of people that you really need to worry about. So all of those official cabinet positions, there's going to be tension between the official government and this secondary government. And as of right now, this kook cabinet seems like it's much closer to Trump's ear, in part because his son, Donald Trump Jr., is among them. And Trump trusts his family more so than he trusts anything else. In the first administration, they came in the form of Ivanka and Jared Kushner, though they've mostly stepped aside this time around. So we get the lesser Trump spawn, which is Trump Jr., him as the decisive member of the family. And though Rubio, as Secretary of State, is one person that Ukrainians are a bit more optimistic about. Keep in mind that ever since Hillary Clinton, no U.S. Secretary of State has had that much power. Most foreign policy decisions have not been referred to in the State Department. That's mostly been a presidential office thing for many administrations now, both Republican and Democrat. But those foreign policy decisions are made in the presidential administration, and that means Vance, Musk, Trump Jr. are closer to that center of power and policy than the official Secretary of State will be. So don't get too excited just because you hear that the Secretary of State could have better Ukraine policies than some others in the administration. He doesn't matter as much as what looks like Vance, Musk, and Trump Jr. will be in that field. And as I say all this, you, as a astute Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union viewer and watcher and an analyst, this sounds a whole lot like Kremlinology, doesn't it? We have an incoming administration where the person at the top, when he says something, has to be taken with absolute unquestioned loyalty, but because he's easily distracted and does not believe in getting too sullied by proper governance, you have to pay attention much more to who this or that courtier is and where they are in the kind of power dynamic and who are the outside forces who will have more influence than the official positions, who the gray cardinals are. This feels a lot like Kremlinology, and that I think is where a lot of the danger is in this administration, is in the arbitrariness, the chaos, the unreliability, and all of that chaos and unreliability only serves to bolster to the position of the czar, because all this chaos happening underneath them tells you that we have the czar we can trust and the boyars that we don't trust. And with this Trump distortion field, we saw it happening with the first Trump administration, where everything bad that happened was just blamed on Kushner rather than Trump himself. So if any of these people screw up, they can be very easily replaced, take all the blame with them, and have Trump still looking shiny at the end. There will be lots of turnover. There will be lots of changes as time goes on. In that fundamental chaos, that is where the danger is. And with Musk especially, the Ukrainian definition of who is an oligarch is basically the combination of political, economic, and media power. And as critical as we may be of the American oligarchy, it's not quite the same as a Russian or even Ukrainian oligarchy, in that there is more of a degree of separation between America's wealthiest billionaires in power. They have to start up a think tank that takes a politician out for a conference where they butter them up and remind them where the donations are coming from. You know, there's layers. There's layers of abstraction there that seem meaningless, but I do think are important compared to what we are about to see. Because Musk is given a position of power where the idea seems to be privatization, where he is trying to control as much of the Trump messaging as possible, where he has bought his way into the Republican Party. That's kind of where Musk came into the campaign. The campaign didn't have much money in places, and Musk injected it with capital in order to keep it going. And all these forms of power coalescing around a single absolute psychopath, where we finally have a true Russia-style oligarch on our hands. And as for our last segment here, how will Trump's policies affect Ukraine? And for that, I'm going to look at specifically the non-Ukraine related policies. The Ukraine stuff is kind of obvious. Trump has this plan for quote-unquote peace in Ukraine that would be an utter disaster. But what are his other things, and how would they affect Ukrainians? In the first one, the thing that the Republicans ran the most on had to do with immigration policy. Ukraine is a country where a significant percentage of its population are now refugees. Most of those refugees are in Europe, but also many of them are in the United States and Canada, of course. But in the United States, the asylum process, the refugee process, is less than ideal. One thing that we can say about the idea of policy and how it doesn't matter is that Trump ran on Kamala Harris and Biden administration being soft on immigration when they just objectively were not. They were quite draconian with immigration. They deported so many people. So the idea of there being an open border is complete nonsense. Another one of these list of things that people believed during the election that was objectively wrong. But immigration, because of America not exactly being welcoming, there had to be certain cutouts to make things easier for Ukrainians. It happened. Many of the programs that Ukrainians on, however, were not written just for Ukrainians, but for example, Afghanistan refugees. And a lot of these programs for Ukrainian and other refugees are about to be cut, including programs that allow for asylum seekers to work. Right now, a Ukrainian can work a job in the United States even while they are on asylum, which is complicated. I'm not going to get into immigration law or whatever, but that's not a default thing. So that's a specific policy that we can talk about. But more generally, the hostility towards refugees, the hostility towards asylum seekers, this hostility towards immigrants is going to affect Ukrainians. People may be deported. They may have support cut off. They may lose their jobs. And this is something that I feel has not been discussed enough within the Ukrainian commentariat, including Ukrainian American, Ukrainian Canadian, etc., is that this idea of migrants, asylum seekers being like a Latin American thing or something like that, and somehow Ukrainians are different, that's just not how it works. There could be other policies that are passed that give more support to Ukrainians, and that will come down to lobbying and, quite frankly, a bit of hypocrisy. But that fight begins now. If you have Ukrainian friends in the United States, if you are Ukrainian and you know people who live in the US, that their status is imperiled right now. That needs to be acted on immediately. And yeah, I don't know how so many see that issue as not affecting Ukrainians, obviously. Next regards Trump's plans for war. And despite being the anti-war president, he wants to go to war with Mexico. I don't know how many times this has to be said before anyone notices or pays attention. Trump has already announced a plan to attack Mexico, specifically to attack the drug cartels within Mexico. But you can't do that. You can't just go into Mexico and start shooting people and not have it be an invasion. The special military operation to destroy the drug cartels. It's nonsense. And there's supposed to be a naval blockade of Mexico in order to prevent things from getting to the cartels and sending assassination teams into Mexico. And that's just a war. That's obviously going to spiral out of control, not as though it's in control to begin with. It's already out of control into war. And that's bad on its own. But in the global context, what we have, and we've talked about this many times before, is what I call the global poly crisis. There are so many bad things happening around the world that any one of them can't really be paid much attention to. America invading Mexico would take that to astonishing heights. Any ability of the United States being able to remain engaged with the rest of the world kind of falls apart in the farce of the U.S. invading Mexico, which will then lead to more of an immigration crisis, which, as I've just said, Ukrainians would suffer for as well, not to mention an economic crisis of Mexico being one of the United States' largest trading partners, with a lot of families existing on both sides of the border, with Mexico and the United States being joined completely at the hip economically, politically. For there to be a war between those two countries, a special military operation between those countries, would be utterly disastrous in ways that we can't even predict right now. It's the level of awful that affects everything. And forget support for Ukraine when America is bombing Guadalajara. And this does seem ridiculous to say. That America invading Mexico seems like something that a lot of people would not support, but Trump specifically said that the way he would take out the Mexican drug cartels would be the same way that he went to war with ISIS during the first administration. And what that looked like was bombing a bunch of stuff. That's what that means. There's no quiet way to do what he is saying. But on the economic issue, and the thing that frustrates me the most when talking to people is trade protectionism and tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. The purpose of this is by increasing the cost of foreign goods. What you produce domestically will be more price competitive. If a what's-it costs $10 to produce in Vietnam, but costs $15 to produce in the United States, if you put the tariff enough that the Vietnamese what's-it now cost $15, then now it's more price competitive with an American thing, which allows that American industry to go on more. And sometimes this is useful. Tariffs are not always a bad thing. I'm not a free market fundamentalist on that. However, when Trump talks about tariffs, he just throws out a random number, which sounds big at the time. The number seems to be 60% right now, specifically on things from China. And then, well, whenever he gives a speech, the number's different. So don't worry too much about pinning a specific number. It's supposed to be a big number. Don't think too hard on what that big number is supposed to be. Mexico's also have to have high tariffs. And also, the rule is supposed to be that anytime a country puts a tariff on American goods, there has to be an increase on the American side, which then, of course, leads to a spiraling escalation of increasing tariffs on each other until you have a full-on trade war. Now, the thing with tariffs is, because like I said, they are meant to increase the cost of foreign goods, but there's no such thing as a foreign good and a domestic good. There's a global economy. The global economy means that the what's-it that's made in the United States has parts from Indonesia, China, and I don't know, Morocco, and those are all imported to be made in the United States. Therefore, when you put import tariffs on each of those things, it means that the domestic good itself becomes more expensive. Basically what I'm saying, and you can get a better explanation of tariffs from people who are better economists than me, we're looking at out of control inflation and increases in costs of living, the exact thing that Americans voted for Trump in order to avoid, even though this policy has been the flagship of the Trump campaign. And it's the kind of bad that isn't, bite down and survive for the next few years. This is potentially crash the global economy bad by trying to wall off the American economy, which is both one of the largest sellers and buyers on the global market. The whole system of the global economy will suffer and be damaged by it. The degree of this damage is still up in the air. If tariffs are only bumped up a little bit to make Trump happy, which is kind of what happened with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Trump presented himself as destroying it because it was so horrible for the American worker. What he replaced it as was with something that was basically identical to NAFTA, but he was able to claim it as a victory because he believed in his mind that he did something. So that's always a possibility with anything that Trump does, is that he can be tricked into thinking he did a change when really he just maintained the status quo. But this seems like something that they're much more serious about this time. So yes, depending on the degree of those tariffs will affect how bad the global economy comes out of it. And how this affects Ukraine is, even if the United States pulls out of supporting Ukraine by a little bit or entirely, there's still the possibility that the Europeans can step in, and they are this is still a bad scenario. This is a very optimistic view that they would be able to do such a thing. However, if there is a global recession because the United States decides to blow up the global economy for no good reason, then that affects the European economy. And if now Europe is going through a recession, they'll have less ability to help Ukraine because of that. They'll have their own people back home saying, why are we paying to defend Ukraine when back home I cannot afford rent and food and I just lost my job? and everything's too expensive. So why are we helping these other people in a different country? And the thing with severe economic recessions is that they also bring or have the potential to have huge political tumult. And we are already looking in places like Germany and France, the rise of the far right. Well, bring in a global recession on top of that, and we have Le Pen in charge of France and AfD in charge of Germany and a European pro-Russian movement and being attacked from both sides. So on one hand, this trade protectionism will devastate America, and a lot of people have been saying, if that's what Americans voted for, then let them suffer for it. But there is no such thing as a purely American problem. In the 2000s, Americans had a bunch of insane mortgage debt based on subprime mortgages. And when that collapsed, it destroyed the global economy for a few years and caused a bunch of upheaval and political changes, etc., because Americans defaulted on some loans. That is nothing compared to what could happen if we get these 60% tariffs. Oh, well, so that's all my election analysis. None of it's good. If you stayed through this whole episode of listening to me doom about the future, I'll do a slight turn here and say that there is still plenty of room for advocating for Ukraine. One aspect of Trump's chaos is that maybe tomorrow he decides that he doesn't like J.D. Vance or Elon Musk anymore, and therefore they're ejected from power, and other people more friendly to Ukraine move in. That's entirely possible. It's entirely possible to maybe flatter Trump enough, and that seems to be what a lot of the Ukrainian commentariat wants to do right now. So what Zelensky is doing right now, you can't really blame him. The idea is to convince Trump that we really are in the best interests of the United States, and we really do like you, and if you help us out enough, we'll put a big statue up of you and everything will be great, and we'll name some streets to Trump Avenue and everything will be awesome. I don't know. I find that a bit distasteful. Kind of the whole point of this war is that Ukrainians shouldn't have to bow and scrape to some tyrannical narcissist just because he controls the power of life and death over you. That's kind of an important concept here. But, I mean, if you're Zelensky, I wouldn't exactly be antagonizing Trump either. Thankfully, I hold no position of authority or influence whatsoever, so I can say what I feel like. There's still, of course, European support, and maybe in the absence of the United States from European security, the Europeans will finally take seriously the fact that they have to defend their continent. And there's also just the aspect of the American government being a very large boat that's very difficult to turn. Lots of momentum there in the massive bureaucratic and political machine of the United States. And in the first Trump administration, they were not very good at controlling that, to the point where a lot of what it was in the end was a more cruel, but still not entirely different from a regular Republican administration. And if they're locked in that status of not being able to control things that they want to control long enough, then that's time to work with. And in the Vance episode, we talked about Project 2025 and that being a possible remedy that the far right of the Republican Party wanted to use to take better control of the mechanics of government. Trump didn't really seem to be very interested in that. So how well that the Trump administration will be able to staff the government with loyalists, which what Project 2025 was ultimately about, that's in consideration. If they're not able to actually control the government, then that momentum can be worked in Ukraine's favor. So yeah, lots of possibilities there. It's not, the doom has not yet come. Ukraine is not yet dead. There is still a tomorrow. Politics does not end with elections. Get out there onto your representatives, talk to people in your lives and remind them that the Ukrainian cause is still an important one to the world and to you. Politics often is one person talking to another who is trusted about something they care about, but things are looking rough. and your support is needed now more than ever. So, as always, go to that link tree, find some Ukrainian causes to support, call your representatives to make sure that the cause of the Ukrainian people does not die off in the halls of Washington. And if that global economic collapse comes, you may not have much additional funds to throw people, but in the meantime, before that, you can head over to patreon.com/UkraineWithoutHype to support this podcast. And you can go to patreon.com/NVUA to support the New Voice of Ukraine, the news outlet that both Romeo and I work for and could use the support right now as well. That is, daily news about everything in Ukraine and the kind of information that people really need and lets them know that Ukraine's a real place with real people with real struggles and not some political football to be put away because the game is over. So yeah, your support is needed now more than ever. Media in particular is going to go through some bad times. So if you feel like transferring some of that support away from some of the outlets in America that kind of did not cover themselves in glory during this election and transfer it to something that is much more needed, consider Ukraine. So thank you all very much for listening. We'll soon be returning to more regular podcast episodes as I return to Ukraine and therefore Ukrainian time frame. So I'd like to thank our Patreon subscribers, and there are a few more of you this month, even though we've been slow with the releases. But so thank you very much for jumping on. I hope you've been enjoying the backlog. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aiden, Alex, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Lori Khalila, Lemonkin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Settle Knife, Thomas Soviak, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, well, who dreads the next 25 plus years? You and me both, brother. William Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus. Thank you all very much for your support and for your patience. And until next episode, Slava Ukraini.